It was a calm, golden morning in the Pacific. The sun rose gently over the waves, and the island of Oahu seemed to breathe in peace. Birds circled lazily over palm trees, and the distant hum of engines at Pearl Harbor was nothing out of the ordinary. For most Americans stationed there, it was just another Sunday, a day of rest, laughter, and lazy breakfasts. No one knew that within the next hour, their world would be engulfed in fire and chaos. Thousands of miles away, hidden beneath grey clouds and icy winds, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers sliced through the waters of the North Pacific. Their decks were lined with planes, bombers, torpedo aircraft, and deadly fighters painted with red suns. On board, the crews prepared in silence, their faces calm, their hearts steady. The mission they had trained for was not just another military strike. It was a bold gamble that would change the course of history. The fleet's commander, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, stood in his quarters, staring at a map of the Pacific. He was not a man who loved war. In fact, he had studied in the United States and admired its power, its industry, and its people. But he also understood that Japan was cornered. The American oil embargo had cut off the lifeline of the Japanese war machine. Without fuel, their ships would stop, their planes would be grounded, and their dream of an empire across Asia would crumble. In Tokyo, the government and the emperor's advisors had made their decision. If the United States would not allow Japan to expand freely in Asia, then Japan would strike first. Yamamoto had warned them. He once said, "In the first 6 months, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But after that, I have no expectation of success." He knew the sleeping power of the United States, but he was a soldier, and orders were orders. The plan was already set in motion. The American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor had to be destroyed before it could ever fight back. For days, the Japanese fleet sailed in total silence. No radio messages, no contact with home. The cold ocean winds cut through the decks, and the men whispered among themselves, some praying, some thinking of their families far away. Every man knew what this meant. If discovered, they would be doomed. But if successful, they could cripple the United States before it even entered the war. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., diplomats from Japan were still meeting with American officials, pretending that peace was still possible. They smiled politely, exchanged papers, and discussed meaningless conditions. But behind the curtain of diplomacy, Japan's attack force was already closing in. On December 6, 1941, the final coded message from Tokyo arrived to the Japanese embassy in Washington. It was a long message. Part of it would be delivered the next morning. It said that Japan would soon break off relations with the United States. The Americans intercepted the message, but by the time they decoded it, it was already too late. The next morning, December 7th, dawned quiet and bright in Hawaii. The air was warm, the sea calm. Sailors aboard the battleships of Pearl Harbor were still waking up. Some were reading letters from home, others were polishing brass, and some were attending Sunday morning services. The USS Arizona, the pride of the harbor, stood still in the water, her flag rising slowly with the breeze. Nobody knew death was only minutes away. At 6 a.m., about 230 miles north of Oahu, the first wave of Japanese aircraft began to take off. The engines roared like thunder over the ocean. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the lead pilot, checked his watch and adjusted his goggles. The operation had begun. Below them, the fleet's carriers disappeared into the fog as the aircraft disappeared into the blue sky, flying in formation toward the sleeping island. The pilots knew this was a surprise attack. The Americans would not be ready. Every man carried the image of the emperor in his mind, and the pride of Japan in his chest. Back in Pearl Harbor, American radar operators did pick up strange signals. Dozens of aircraft approaching from the north. But the officer on duty dismissed it, thinking it was a squadron of American B-17 bombers expected from the mainland. No one sounded the alarm. The fate of thousands was sealed by a simple misunderstanding. At 7:49 a.m., Fuchida looked down through the clouds and saw the outline of Pearl Harbor glimmering below. The ships were neatly lined up, unsuspecting, beautiful targets under the morning sun. He grabbed his radio and sent the code that would echo forever in history. Tora, Tora, Tora. It meant that complete surprise had been achieved. Seconds later, the first bombs fell. Explosions ripped through the still morning air. Torpedoes dropped into the water and streaked toward the American battleships. The USS Oklahoma was hit first. 1, 2, 3 torpedoes slammed into her hull, and she began to roll over almost immediately. Inside, sailors scrambled in panic, trapped as the ship turned upside down. The USS Arizona took a direct hit from a bomb that penetrated her forward magazines. In one blinding instant, she erupted into a massive fireball, lifting her out of the water. More than 1,000 men were killed instantly. The sky turned black with smoke. Alarms wailed. The sound of gunfire and screaming filled the air. The once peaceful harbor had become hell on earth. Sailors who had been eating breakfast were now diving into flaming oil-covered water. Men tried to rescue their friends from burning ships, while others manned anti-aircraft guns, desperately firing at the planes swooping down like hawks. Japanese pilots attacked in waves, machine-gunning airfields and strafing anything that moved. The surprise was total. On the ground, dozens of American planes were destroyed before they could even take off. The Japanese had studied every inch of the harbor. They knew exactly where to strike, exactly which ships to hit, exactly how to cause the most destruction in the shortest time. Meanwhile, in the sky, Fuchida watched the chaos below with grim satisfaction. His mission was succeeding. He saw explosions, fires, and columns of black smoke rising higher and higher. Ships burned, planes exploded, and the harbor looked like the mouth of a volcano. He sent back the report. Enemy fleet neutralized. Back on the ships, chaos reigned. The USS West Virginia was taking heavy damage. The USS California was sinking, and the USS Nevada tried to escape down the harbor channel, firing as she went. But Japanese dive bombers quickly spotted her, and within minutes, she too was crippled. The Japanese pilots were relentless. Every bomb, every torpedo was placed with deadly precision. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived. Another 170 planes. They came roaring in, targeting what was left. They struck the airfields again, ensuring that no American planes could follow them. At Hickam Field, hangars exploded like matchboxes. At Wheeler Airfield, rows of P-40 fighters were set ablaze. The Americans fought back with everything they had. Some gunners, bleeding and half-burned, refused to leave their posts. One pilot, George Welch, managed to take off through the smoke and shot down several Japanese planes before he was hit himself. For 2 long hours, the attack continued. Bombs fell, ships sank, and the waters of Pearl Harbor turned red. By the time it ended, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, nearly 1,200 wounded, and the pride of the US Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Japan had lost only 29 planes. It was a devastating blow, the kind of victory the Japanese military had dreamed of. But even amid the chaos, some ships still stood. The aircraft carriers, the true heart of modern naval warfare, were not in the harbour that morning. They were out at sea on training missions. That small twist of fate would change everything in the months to come. At around 10 a.m., the last Japanese plane turned for home. Pearl Harbor burned behind them. The sea was covered in oil and debris, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of death. Rescue boats moved slowly between the wrecks, pulling survivors from the water, many covered in burns, their uniforms in tatters. The sight was unbearable. The American sailors, who had known peace only hours earlier, were now standing in the ruins of their fleet. Back in Japan, news of the victory spread like wildfire. Crowds cheered in the streets, newspapers declared a great triumph, and military leaders celebrated. They believed they had destroyed America's spirit in a single morning. But far away in Washington, a quiet, determined anger was already forming. When the news reached President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he sat in silence for a long time, his face pale but calm. Then he spoke a single sentence. "This will be a date which will live in infamy." The next day, he went before Congress and declared war on Japan. His speech lasted only a few minutes, but it moved an entire nation. America, once hesitant and divided, was now united in fury. Factories that had been quiet began to roar with production. Thousands of young men lined up to enlist. The American people, shocked and grieving, now burned with purpose. Japan had achieved what its leaders wanted least. They had awoken a sleeping giant. As the fires in Pearl Harbor continued to burn, Admiral Yamamoto received the success report aboard his flagship. The mission was complete. But he felt no joy. He looked out over the ocean and said softly, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right. What Japan thought was its greatest victory would soon become the reason for its ultimate defeat. The smoke over Pearl Harbor lingered for days. The once peaceful bay had become a graveyard of twisted metal and blackened ships. The scent of oil and death hung in the air, drifting across the waves. Sailors, exhausted and heartbroken, searched the wrecks for survivors. Divers worked tirelessly, sometimes hearing faint tapping from inside the capsized hulls of ships like the USS Oklahoma. Some of those trapped men would never be saved. The Pacific Fleet, America's great symbol of naval power, had been shattered. But the spirit of the American people was not. Across the mainland, the news hit like a lightning strike. Radios crackled with the same grim announcement. Japan had launched a surprise attack. Millions stopped what they were doing. Workers, mothers, students, farmers. They listened, silent, their hearts pounding. Then came Roosevelt's voice, firm and grave. His speech to Congress was only a few minutes long, but every word carried the weight of history. He called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, and promised that America would fight back with all its strength. Congress voted almost unanimously for war. The very next day, the United States and Japan were officially at war. Across the Pacific, Japanese leaders celebrated. The Empire of Japan believed it had achieved the impossible. They had destroyed much of the US Pacific Fleet in one morning. Now, nothing could stop their expansion. Within weeks, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. They invaded the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Malaya. Everywhere they went, they moved with terrifying speed and brutal efficiency. Cities fell one after another. The rising sun flag flew from new territories every day. Japanese propaganda claimed that the Pacific would belong to Japan forever, but not everyone in Japan felt victorious. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, sat quietly aboard his flagship as news of victory reached him. He received reports of sunken ships, destroyed planes, and American casualties. The mission had succeeded perfectly, yet he felt no satisfaction. He had studied in America, lived there, and understood its strength. He knew that the Americans would not surrender. He had not wanted this war, but his government had demanded it. Now, it was too late. In America, the pain of Pearl Harbor turned quickly into fury. Factories that had been quiet during the Great Depression came alive. Men and women worked side by side, building planes, ships, tanks, and weapons faster than anyone believed possible. Recruitment lines stretched around city blocks, newspapers filled with stories of bravery and loss. Families hung flags with gold stars in their windows, symbols of sons who would never return. America's vast industrial power was awakening, just as Yamamoto had feared. The United States needed to strike back, fast. The American people demanded it. But the question was how. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The nearest bases were too far away for a direct counterattack. The Japanese controlled the seas, and their victories seemed unstoppable. Then, in the shadows of the Pentagon, a bold idea began to take shape. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a short, calm man with a fearless heart, came forward with a plan that seemed almost impossible. He proposed to launch American bombers from an aircraft carrier, something that had never been done before, and strike directly at the Japanese homeland. It would be a symbolic strike, a message to Japan that America was not broken. It wouldn't destroy their military, but it would destroy their sense of invulnerability. Preparations began in secret. 16 B-25 bombers were modified to take off from the deck of the carrier USS Hornet. The crews trained tirelessly, practicing short takeoffs, long flights, and low-level bombing runs. They knew this mission was dangerous. It was a one-way trip. There would be no way to return to the carrier after the attack. The plan was to bomb Japan and then fly on to China, hoping to land safely or bail out. On April 18, 1942, the Doolittle Raiders took off from the Hornet in rough seas. The waves crashed against the carrier as the bombers, heavy with fuel and bombs, roared down the deck and lifted into the air. One by one, they disappeared into the clouds, heading straight for Japan. Hours later, the city of Tokyo heard the distant hum of engines. Japanese citizens looked up in shock. American planes were over their capital. Sirens wailed. Bombs began to fall on Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. The physical damage was small, but the psychological impact was massive. For the first time, the Japanese people realized they were not untouchable. When word of the Doolittle raid reached the Japanese military, shock turned to rage. They were humiliated. The attack had pierced their pride, and the emperor's image of divine protection had been shaken. Yamamoto, who commanded the Imperial fleet, immediately began planning to crush the Americans once and for all. He believed that if Japan could destroy what remained of the US Navy, they could force America into negotiation before its industry could fully mobilize. The place he chose for this decisive battle was a small, remote atoll in the Pacific. Midway. Midway Atoll was a speck in the ocean, strategically located between Asia and America. It was little more than a dot of land surrounded by endless sea. But for Yamamoto, it was the key to dominating the Pacific. He planned to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. His strategy was to attack Midway, forcing the Americans to come to its defense. Then, his carriers would ambush them and annihilate what was left of the US fleet. It was a perfect plan. On paper. But Japan didn't know that the Americans had already broken their naval code. Cryptographers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had deciphered key Japanese messages. They knew an attack was coming, and they even knew when and where. The US Pacific Fleet, now under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, began to prepare an ambush of its own. In late May 1942, both fleets began moving toward Midway. The Japanese force was massive: 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and a powerful escort fleet. The Americans had only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. But they had the advantage of surprise. The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned bright and clear over the Pacific. Japanese planes launched the first attack on Midway Island, bombing the airfields and installations. The American defenders fought back fiercely, sending up every aircraft they could, even outdated ones. Many pilots never returned. But as the Japanese prepared a second wave, their decks were cluttered with bombs and torpedoes, waiting to reload for the next strike. Then, at that very moment, American dive bombers arrived. The first waves had missed completely or been shot down, but fate and timing guided this new group right to the heart of the Japanese fleet. The pilots dove from 20,000 feet, through clouds of smoke and anti-aircraft fire. Within minutes, the tide of war turned. Bombs struck the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu almost simultaneously. Explosions tore through their decks. Fuel lines ignited. Planes loaded with bombs erupted in flames. The sky filled with black smoke. Crews screamed as they tried to save their ships, but it was hopeless. The once mighty carriers were engulfed in fire. Later that day, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a desperate counterattack, managing to hit the USS Yorktown. But by the end of the day, Hiryu too was found and destroyed. 4 Japanese carriers, the heart of their navy, were gone. The Battle of Midway was over, and Japan's dream of total domination in the Pacific was shattered. The US had lost 1 carrier, but the balance of power had shifted forever. When the survivors returned to Japan, the shock was immense. The country that had celebrated its unstoppable victories now faced the bitter taste of defeat. The emperor's commanders were silent. The people were not told the full truth. But Yamamoto knew. His worst fear had come true. The sleeping giant he had awakened was now fully awake, armed, and coming for them. In America, the news of Midway spread like wildfire. The same people who had mourned after Pearl Harbor now celebrated. It was the first major victory for the United States in the Pacific. Newspapers declared it revenge. The American spirit soared higher than ever. For the first time, people believed that Japan could be beaten. In the following months, American production accelerated beyond imagination. New carriers were launched, new planes rolled off assembly lines, and an endless flow of supplies and soldiers began to cross the Pacific. Japan had started the war with speed and surprise, but now America had something far stronger: time, industry, and determination. Yamamoto, though still respected, began to see cracks forming in Japan's war machine. Resources were running low. Factories struggled to replace what was lost. The once feared Japanese fleet was now on the defensive. The empire that had seemed unstoppable after Pearl Harbor was beginning to tremble. But the war was far from over. Across the Pacific, fierce battles awaited in the jungles of Guadalcanal, the beaches of Iwo Jima, and the skies over the Philippines. Both nations were now locked in a struggle that would decide the fate of the entire world. The ocean that had once belonged to Japan now began to close in around it. The once proud Imperial Navy that had struck fear across the Pacific was bleeding, losing ships, planes, and men faster than it could replace them. The Battle of Midway had not just been a defeat, it had been a wound that would never heal. But Japan refused to surrender. Its leaders told the people that victory was still within reach, that Japan's divine destiny could not be stopped. Factories worked day and night, soldiers marched to the sound of patriotic songs, and young men lined up to die for the emperor. Across the ocean, in the United States, things had changed completely. The anger born at Pearl Harbor had turned into a massive war machine. American factories once making cars and refrigerators now produce planes, tanks, and ships faster than the world had ever seen. Every week, new aircraft carriers were launched. Every day, hundreds of new planes rolled out. Women filled the factories, welding steel and loading ammunition, while men shipped out to the Pacific. The United States had become a nation at war, and the Pacific Ocean was its battlefield. Admiral Chester Nimitz, calm and sharp-minded, now led the US Pacific Fleet. His strategy was simple but bold. Don't fight everywhere, fight smart. He called it island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, the Americans would skip the heavily defended ones and seize key positions, cutting off Japan's supply lines one by one. The plan would bring them closer and closer to the Japanese homeland. The first real test came in a place few Americans had heard of: Guadalcanal. It was a humid green island in the Solomon chain, far from home, but it was the first step in pushing Japan back. In August 1942, US Marines landed on its beaches. The jungle was thick, the heat suffocating, and the enemy hidden everywhere. What began as a simple landing turned into months of brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Japanese soldiers, refusing to surrender, launched wave after wave of night attacks, screaming "Banzai" as they charged through the darkness. The Americans fought back with everything they had: rifles, bayonets, flamethrowers. The battle turned the island into a nightmare of mud, blood, and exhaustion. For 6 long months, the struggle for Guadalcanal raged. The Japanese Navy sent ships at night to resupply their troops, while American planes hunted them by day. The ocean around the island became known as Iron Bottom Sound, because so many ships lay at its bottom. But in the end, the Japanese withdrew. It was their first major loss on land, and for the first time, their soldiers left the field defeated. The victory at Guadalcanal gave America hope. From there, the island-hopping campaign began to unfold across the Pacific. One by one, islands fell: Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each name would become a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and horror. Every battle was bloodier than the last. Japanese soldiers dug deep into caves and bunkers, turning each island into a fortress. Surrender was not an option for them. Many fought to the death. Others took their own lives rather than be captured. By 1944, American bombers were flying closer and closer to Japan. The once invincible Imperial Navy was now on the defensive, trying to stop the tide with what little it had left. The seas that had once carried Japan's power now carried American fleets, vast armadas of carriers, battleships, and troop transports. The skies that had once been ruled by the rising sun were now filled with American aircraft. In the summer of 1944, the US invaded the Mariana Islands. The Japanese fleet tried one last time to stop them. It ended in disaster: the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American pilots shot down hundreds of Japanese planes in what would be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost so many pilots that it could never replace them. The US now had a clear path to the Philippines. As American troops moved forward, Japan's empire began to collapse. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur made his return, wading through the surf as he had promised years earlier. The fighting there was fierce and tragic. Cities were reduced to rubble, and the once proud Japanese army fought with desperate courage. But no matter how hard they resisted, the outcome was already written. The Japanese soldiers were running out of ammunition, fuel, and even food. Starvation spread across their garrisons. Back in Tokyo, the government still refused to consider surrender. The military controlled everything, and the people were told that Japan was winning. Civilians were urged to prepare for a final defense of the homeland. Young boys were trained to use bamboo spears. Girls learned to throw grenades. The idea of surrender was considered shameful, worse than death. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack, never saw how far Japan would fall. In 1943, American intelligence intercepted his flight plans, and US fighters ambushed his plane over the jungles of Bougainville. The architect of the attack that began the war in the Pacific was killed in the sky. For Japan, it was a symbolic loss. The mine that had once led their empire to glory was gone, and the nation was now drifting toward disaster. As the war dragged on, the Japanese began using a terrifying new tactic, the kamikaze. The word meant divine wind. These were suicide pilots who volunteered to crash their planes, loaded with explosives, directly into American ships. It was a desperate measure born of hopelessness. Many of these pilots were barely out of their teens. They wrote farewell letters to their families, then flew into the sky knowing they would never return. Their planes, painted with the red sun, dove out of the clouds toward the American ships below. Some hit their targets, turning steel into fire. Others missed, falling into the sea. The Americans respected their courage, but were horrified by the fanaticism that drove them. The war reached a new level of brutality at Iwo Jima. The island was small, just 8 square miles of volcanic rock, but it was vital for Japan's defense. The Japanese had dug an entire city underground. Tunnels, bunkers, and gun positions that could survive endless bombardment. When the US Marines landed in February 1945, they faced hell on earth. The black sand made movement almost impossible. Machine gun fire came from invisible holes in the ground. The Japanese refused to retreat, fighting until they were dead. For 36 days, the battle raged. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and more than 20,000 Japanese died. When the island was finally secured, a small group of Marines raised the American flag on Mount Suribachi. A photographer captured the moment, and it became one of the most iconic images of the entire war. Yet even Iwo Jima was not the end. The next target was Okinawa, the final stepping stone before the Japanese mainland. The battle there was unlike anything before. It lasted almost 3 months. The Japanese army dug deep again, determined to make the Americans pay for every inch. Kamikaze attacks became constant. Ships burned, planes fell, and soldiers fought in rain, mud, and death. Civilians were caught in the middle. Tens of thousands died, many taking their own lives in despair. By the time it ended, Okinawa was a graveyard. More than 12,000 Americans were dead, and nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers were gone. The victory came at a terrible cost. The US military looked toward Japan itself and realized what lay ahead. If they had to invade the home islands, the losses would be unimaginable. American generals estimated that it could take 1 million Allied lives to defeat Japan completely. The thought chilled them. In Washington and in secret labs across America, scientists were working on something that could end the war without that invasion. Something new, something terrifying. They called it the Manhattan Project. And deep in the deserts of New Mexico, a new kind of weapon was about to change the world forever. The sun was beginning to set over a nation in ruins. Tokyo lay in ashes. its once bustling streets reduced to rubble and whispers. In the aftermath of countless bombings, Japan was no longer the proud empire that had once dared to strike Pearl Harbor. Its citizens wandered through smoke and debris, clutching memories of the homes and families they had lost. Rice was scarce, hunger was constant, and the military that once dominated Asia was now fractured, desperate, and dying. Yet, even as surrender loomed in the minds of many, the government clung to the illusion of victory. For the generals and admirals who still stood beside Emperor Hirohito, surrender was worse than death. They were determined to fight to the very last man. In 1945, the United States had closed in from every direction. From the Philippines to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese military had suffered devastating losses. Each island captured brought the US closer to Japan's mainland. The once mighty Imperial Navy was practically gone, its remnants hiding in harbors, starved of fuel. The skies belonged to the Americans, whose bombers flew freely, raining destruction on cities that had once symbolized Japanese pride. The people, once taught that the emperor was divine and that Japan was invincible, now whispered fears they had never dared to speak aloud, that perhaps the war was lost. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito sat in silence, his face pale and weary. He had always been portrayed as a godlike figure, yet now he was just a man trapped between pride and survival. The war had spiraled far beyond his control. Advisors came and went, each bringing worse news than the last. American forces had captured Okinawa, the final stepping stone before an invasion of Japan itself. Hirohito knew what that meant. If the Americans landed on the mainland, Japan would cease to exist. Millions would die. But still, some of his generals refused to give in. They called for the mobilization of every man, woman, and child to defend the homeland. They would turn the beaches into killing grounds and the cities into fortresses. The idea of surrender was seen as a betrayal of their ancestors and their honor. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Harry S. Truman faced an equally heavy burden. The war in Europe had ended, but the Pacific conflict dragged on. American soldiers were exhausted, yet the Japanese showed no signs of giving up. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown just how far Japan was willing to go. Soldiers fought to the death, civilians committed suicide rather than be captured, and prisoners were rare. Truman's generals estimated that an invasion of Japan could cost over 1 million American lives, and far more Japanese lives. The American public was tired of war, but they demanded victory, not negotiation. The world had already seen the horrors of this global conflict, and Truman sought a way to end it, swiftly and decisively. At the same time, deep in the deserts of New Mexico, scientists under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer had completed their grim masterpiece, the atomic bomb. Born from a race against Nazi Germany, it had now become a weapon to end Japan's defiance. The test, codenamed Trinity, proved the bomb's terrible power. When Truman received confirmation of its success, the course of the war changed forever. He saw it as the key to ending the conflict without a bloody invasion. In July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, the Allies issued an ultimatum. Japan must surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government refused. They believed it was a bluff. Then came August 6, 1945. The morning was clear and bright over Hiroshima. Children were walking to school, workers were beginning their day, and the air smelled faintly of the nearby river. At 8:15 a.m., a single B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew overhead. Inside, the crew released a small, unassuming object. Little boy. Within seconds, the sky turned into a blazing sun. A thunderous flash engulfed the city, vaporizing everything within a mile. The heart of Hiroshima disappeared in an instant. Tens of thousands died instantly. Tens of thousands more would perish from burns and radiation. The world had never witnessed such devastation. The news spread quickly, but Japan still hesitated. The military believed it was merely a new type of bomb, nothing more. 3 days later, on August 9th, the second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. Again, destruction beyond imagination. The two explosions wiped out over 100,000 lives and crippled Japan's ability to continue. But even after these horrors, the war hawks within the government resisted surrender. They argued that dying with honor was better than yielding to the enemy. However, reality had become undeniable. The Soviet Union, once neutral in the Pacific, had declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The Japanese Empire was collapsing from every direction. That night, Emperor Hirohito made his decision. For the first time in Japan's history, the emperor would address his people directly. On August 15, 1945, his voice was broadcast over the radio, soft, trembling, yet resolute. Many Japanese citizens fell to their knees, weeping as they heard their divine ruler speak. His words were careful, avoiding the word surrender. But the meaning was clear. The war was over. Japan would lay down its arms. The unthinkable had happened. The nation that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had once dreamed of ruling Asia, had fallen. The reaction across Japan was a mixture of shock, relief, and sorrow. Some soldiers refused to accept the emperor's words and tried to stage a coup to continue the war, but it failed. The rest of the nation was too broken to fight anymore. Families mourned their sons who would never return, their cities reduced to ashes. For the first time in centuries, Japan would be occupied by foreign forces. The American military, under General Douglas MacArthur, arrived soon after to oversee the rebuilding of a nation that had once tried to destroy them. When MacArthur met Hirohito, it was a meeting unlike any other. The emperor, once revered as a god, stood before the general of the enemy he could not defeat. Yet, in that moment, both men understood that Japan's future depended on peace, not pride. MacArthur chose not to punish the emperor, but to use him as a symbol of unity during Reconstruction. Japan was forced to give up its military ambitions, to rewrite its constitution, and to embrace democracy. The people who had once worshipped war were now forced to confront its consequences. And so, from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a new Japan began to rise. Factories that once built warplanes now built cars and radios. Soldiers returned home and became workers, engineers, and teachers. The same discipline that had once fueled the empire's aggression now powered its recovery. America too changed. The victory that had once seemed glorious now carried a haunting weight. The world had entered the atomic age, and the memory of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and the fire that answered it would forever remind humanity of the cost of war. In the end, the story of Japan's attack on the United States was not just about bombs, battles, or empires. It was about ambition, pride, and the tragic blindness that war brings. What began as a daring strike meant to secure dominance became a chain of events that led to unimaginable destruction. The men who planned Pearl Harbor could never have imagined their cities burning under a different kind of sun. History would remember their courage, their cruelty, and their downfall as a lesson carved into the memory of nations. From the rising sun to the burning sky, Japan's journey through the Second World War stands as one of humanity's most profound stories, a tale of how power can consume itself and how even in the darkest aftermath, rebirth is still possible.